Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, where we attempt to give Olympian judgments above the squabbles of mere mortals, but it's a bit foggy up here, so we don't always quite manage that. More seriously, this is a place for grown-up discussions for grown-up people about topics relating to history, religion, and culture. My name's Mike Pierce, by the way. I always forget to say that.
My name is Coel Campo, and today is the third episode in our series on secularization. And today's episode is called When Nationalism Was Impiety.
Right. Well, for those who've been following this series, in the first episode, we looked at social processes, which I would argue, and in fact, most people who study this would argue, are more important in secularizing society than the sets of ideas that most people pay most attention to. Nevertheless, those ideas are important, and so in subsequent episodes, we're looking at those. Last week, we looked at Enlightenment rationalism and the way that either implicitly and in some cases explicitly assailed Christian verities. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of nationalism, which is perhaps not the first thing that most people would think of when they're thinking about secularization, and perhaps particularly not over the past century or so, including the present. But it's a tangled little story, so we will come to that presently. Some of you might recognize the painting we've got on our title page here, which is Liberty Leading the People, a painting from 1830. And this particularly will put lots of us in mind of Victor Hugo's amazing novel, and in more recent years, particularly a show and a film, Les Miserables. And he actually says, if you wish to understand what revolution is, call it progress. And if you wish to understand what progress is, call it tomorrow.
So, revolution, progress, and tomorrow, this sounds like a whole bunch of Enlightenment themes all coming together.
Yes, it is. The Enlightenment thinkers certainly didn't call for revolution, but their ideas underpinned, well, in many ways, the American Revolution, but even more the French Revolution. That hadn't necessarily, as I say, been their intention, but that was the way things worked out. And certainly the progress myth, as we would now say, because it's generally exploded, but the idea of progress is very much a product of the Enlightenment. And Victor Hugo pretty much subscribed to that, and certainly was very good at expressing it. Obviously, his novel deals with the turmoil of his own times. Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, the relationship between nationalism and secularization is actually a bit of a tangled mess. And we're going to try and pick that apart as clearly as we can. As in all of our episodes, we are simplifying as we're going along. Anybody can accuse us in any of our episodes of oversimplification, but in a sense, that's quite deliberate. We're trying to make this as accessible as possible to non-specialists. And in particular, we have had a big problem, haven't we, in making this particular episode, because we had, even following our own general pattern of simplification, just so much stuff to squeeze in here that we've had to make some very painful cuts just to produce what we're about to give you now. But
Well, I don't know what kind of feedback you've been getting, but I don't think anyone could accuse you of oversimplifying anything.
oh, that's painful, but they may be right. Wow. Well, okay, in that case, they might be particularly disappointed in this episode, because it's kind of impossible to keep the thing really simple. As I say, the relationship is a tangled mess, but we're going to try and pick the threads apart as clearly as we can. The central point is that nationalism, the long-term effect of it, is indeed secularizing. So we're calling this first section nationalism as the enemy of Christendom.
Now, Christendom here doesn't mean Christianity, right? It means like the idea of Christian state.
Yes, Yes. As we saw in last week's episode, a number of basically all of the main Enlightenment thinkers, one thinks particularly perhaps of Voltaire, assailed the idea that there should be a compulsory religion, one religion of the state. And what we mean by Christendom is not simply the sum total of all Christians in the world. That's not really what it means. It refers to the idea of a strong connection between church and state and the idea of a Christian country. And nationalism is certainly undermining that. Nationalism is one of the most important of these Enlightenment projects, Enlightenment creeds, if you like. And it takes an effort of mind for us now, after the experience of the 20th century, looking back, from the early 21st century, to remember that in the 19th century, nationalism tended to be liberal, democratic, or at least parliamentarian. Not all nationalists seriously wanted democracy, some did, but they at least wanted generally a widening of the franchise, that means the vote given to more people, and more power to parliaments and elected bodies and less to kings. They weren't necessarily all Republicans, though a number were. And that tended to make them secular, because in the period from which they were emerging, there's this very strong connection between equal authority and an official church. And that was particularly true in Catholic countries, but it was true in Protestant and Orthodox ones as well.
Now, just going back to this word liberal for a minute, because it doesn't mean the same thing now that it did in the 19th century, right?
Right. Well, both the terms liberal and conservative are relative terms. This realization will come with a shudder, I suppose, to a number of people, perhaps more to conservatives than to liberals, but perhaps to both. Something is defined as being liberal or conservative relative to the present state of affairs. And if you want to understand that, most people today who would call themselves very strongly conservative, if we could transport them back in a time machine to, the early 19th century, would count not just as liberals, but as outright radicals, right? And in the same way, liberalism has shifted its ground. Certainly nobody in that period was arguing for the kind of things that liberals standardly want today. So liberal meant liberty, freedom. So it meant a loosening of traditional restrictions, a loosening of ties between church and state, or even their abolition, a weakening of the power of monarchs, freedom of the press, freedom of religious confession, equal positions under the law for religious and other minorities, this kind of thing.
Another way we could say this is that these ideas are more progressive.
I'm a little allergic to the term progressive because this is one of my many bugbears, and you know that I have a few, because progressive tends to imply that we're subscribing to the progress myth, and very few people do nowadays, and certainly I don't, but also that we know which direction progress is moving, right? Which I would certainly want to deny. But going along with what is by now traditional usage, yes, of course, you are right. The other thing that we should note, I suppose, is that nationalism tends to be strongest amongst urban people, and particularly the middle classes. So cities are growing during this period in different countries at different rates, but they're the people who are really picking up on this, as indeed other modern ideas.
Is there a reason why urban and why middle class in particular?
Yes, basically, this has been kind of like a truism throughout history. There's another expression I'm allergic to. For many, many centuries, that new ideas tend to penetrate towns first. I mean, we still see this today. And one only has to look at, America, for example, and the kind of political divisions there. Where do you find the the highest popularity for new or newish ideas? Well, in urban centres. And where do you find people more attached to what now counts as conservative ways of thinking? Well, in the countryside and in the suburbs, right? It's not an absolute division, but it's pretty overwhelming nevertheless. And this has been true across many centuries.
Here in the U.S., we're coming up on an election, so we have to be
Well,
careful what
yeah,
we
no, I
say
know.
here.
uh, I select my targets for outrage quite carefully, actually. Yes, so I'm tiptoeing carefully through the tulips there. The other thing I should say is, by the way, that people should refer to episode 5 of our series on Why the Rest Hates the West, which looks at the emergence of national identity in modern times and how and why this occurs. So we can go too far into that here. We're simply observing this general phenomenon as a fact. And of course, it's also true, particularly noticeable in modern times, that peasants are generally attached to tradition for the sake of tradition. So if nationalism picks up in cities and the middle class, it tends to be opposed by monarchs who feel threatened by it, and religious authorities who are closely tied to monarchs. And it's viewed by peasants with indifference or even hostility as a sort of urban affectation that's nothing to do with them. They're attached to the old orders of society.
Yeah, I see this as sort of like group behavior. Like everybody wants to feel like they belong to a particular group, and for a lot of people, that used to be religion.
Yes, this is far less marked in America because it's so pluralistic, and significantly less marked in Britain as well, because that's fairly pluralistic and much more open. But in most countries in continental Europe, yes, because it's something that is felt particularly by people who adhere to the official and traditional church of whichever country they're in. And as we shall see, that's particularly true amongst them of Catholics in Catholic countries. Yes. So, what we're going to do here is look at a number of nationalist paintings from the late 18th and early 19th centuries that portray this new sensibility really rather well. The first of them is taken from the French Revolutionary period, and it portrays Lafayette taking the oath to the nation, to France, and the Constitution at the altar, not a Catholic altar, but the altar of the patrie, the motherland, in July 1790. There's a crucifix there, all right. You can see it on that little table covered with a blue cloth, but it has no figure of Christ. Instead, it's got a serpent on it, which is a Masonic symbol. Freemasonry had become very influential particularly amongst small traders and people in towns in the late 18th and would continue to be through the 19th century. It's a Masonic symbol of eternity, and the picture is dominated by the new emblem of the tricolour, which is being adopted then as the flag of the new revolutionary France.
And yet somehow heaven appears to be shining down on this scene.
Yes, it's a very French heaven. And this is common to a lot of these kinds of paintings. I mean, a lot of religious people would have looked at this and said, this is blasphemous and idolatrous. It's basically deifying the new collective identity of nation. So when I'm saying it's a very French heaven, that's not simply me diving into my usual mode of sarcasm. That's pretty much literally what's going on there. It's happy to use connotations with traditional Christianity, so there is a cross there, although not in any form that most French people will have been familiar with. It's not a crucifix, and it's got a Masonic symbol on it.
So, a lot of the French philosophers that we looked at last week would have been deists, or like people believing in an unknowable God. And now heaven is
Yes,
being displayed here, and that sort of goes along with this as being a sort of nondescript heaven.
right. And most of the nationalist leaders in all countries were deists. That at least was the middle ground of them. Some slipped off the other end into outright agnosticism, and others did adhere to some church or other, but they were generally rather unorthodox and unhappy members of whatever church they continued to bless with their presence. But yes. Now we see the same thing, and again, staying with revolutionary France, in this next painting. It's by a painter with a rather un-French name. You can see he's Italian, Bartolomeo Pinelli, and it's a painting of Claude-Joseph Rouget de Lille, composing the Marseillaise, the new French national anthem. This was a great period for the composition of national anthems. That's where they mostly come from, as well as the invention of national dress, although it comes a little bit later into the 19th century, actually, and this kind of thing. Well, Delille composed the Marseillaise in 1792, and it's adopted as the anthem of the new France in 1795. So you can see he's being inspired by an angel, but a very French angel brandishing the tricolour. So again, this is a French heaven. And the next painting is even more striking. This is the apotheosis of French heroes who died for their country. So heaven opening and pouring down glory onto these heroes who died, who are now being resurrected. So again, any Catholic person will have looked at this and said, well, this is just completely blasphemous. It's almost like a copy of, if you've seen Bernini's statue of the Ecstasy of St. Teresa of Avila. Okay, that's a statue, not a painting, but it's the idea of heaven opening, pouring out. It's very much in Catholic Counter-Reformation art mold of 100, 200 years before.
Religious people would have noticed and resented the fact that these religious undertones were sort of being used in this way, in a secular way.
Right. Certainly if they were at all informed religious people, and particularly devout. People who are perhaps merely nominally Catholic, they might even have felt that there was some degree of continuity, because, as with each of these paintings, they're using some Christian ideas as sort of connotations for the new order. Now, okay, we notice this particularly in the case of France, but other countries did the same sort of thing as well. The British were a smug lot, and in this period had a lot to be smug about. They didn't have these kinds of nationalist paroxysms because they'd had a constitutional monarchy for quite a while now. They certainly did have troubles of their own coming into the early 19th century. There's no minimizing of that. But that they were sitting very pretty. The Royal Navy wasn't absolutely ruling the waves at this period, but it was just entering into the point where that was the case. So this painting here of the death of Admiral Nelson, killed in the hour of his greatest victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. He dies on his battleship HMS Victory, and you can see him here. And he's bathed in light, and it looks like an awful lot more light than seems to be streaming from the lamp. So it's presumably coming from heaven, and he's made to look almost Christ-like. But of course, he's actually a battle casualty. So even the Brits are doing it, though at a rather lower level. Moving on to our next picture, this is the one we started with. This is Eugène Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People in 1830, a further set of upheavals in France. There were several during the course of the 19th century. So France personified as a bare-breasted woman, waving the tricolour and leading the crowd forward over dead bodies to a glorious future, and light coming from, well, somewhere, again, a rather vague heaven, one assumes, through the cloud.
Now, all of these paintings could be described as romantic, is that right?
Yes. I would say, and I don't think this is just me being jaundiced, I think this is my attempt at cold analysis here, that there's no nationalism that I can think of that is not inspired by romanticism. Yeah. And so the art that is connected with that is romanticism. It's projecting cosmology onto human affairs. And of course, the atheist or the agnostic could say, well, what's religion doing? Precisely that. But the nationalism is pulling away from religion as traditionally conceived. So on the one hand, whilst it's not denying the existence of a spiritual universe or of God, it is certainly pulling away from any orthodox expression of religion. And yet, it's harking back to this. It's during the course of the French Revolution that there's an attempt to start a new religion, the religion of humanity. And there are other attempts along the same line during the course of the 19th century. So people who are wanting to pull away from Christianity find that they can't do without some basis of legitimation for their desired state of affairs, the nation state, say, that doesn't lie somehow outside of the human framework. And so once you start to do that, well, you're succumbing to nationalism, and the art certainly expresses this. The dramatic gesture and so on. We see the same sort of thing again here. This is Danel, an expiring soldier of liberty. So this is a dying Polish soldier. There were a couple of Polish uprisings against the Russians during the course of the 19th century, because most of Poland was under Russian rule. So he traces with his own blood the song of the legions, affirming that even though he's dying, that the nation lives on. So again, the dramatic gesture. And a painting I think we've encountered before, this one by Jan Matejko, Polonia, so Poland personified as a beautiful woman, chained by the Russians.
Yeah, and for more details on the Polish revolts against Russian rule, you can see episode 2 of our series, Eastern Catastrophes.
Yes, indeed. And we say more about those there. Okay, so to get down to brass tacks with the Roman Catholic Church, and to make our audience smite their brows here, at some period we are going to do a whole series on the 160 years from the French Revolution until Vatican II in the 1960s. So that's 170 years, isn't it? Which I think we can call the agony of the Catholic Church and how it finally recovers in the 1960s. But the huge difficulties that Catholicism had in coming to terms with modernity and modern ideas. Well, Pius VII becomes Pope in 1800. His immediate predecessor, Pius VI, had been a prisoner of the French for the last 3 or 4 years of his reign. And so the new Pius VII reconciles with Napoleon for a while, but he was nevertheless himself imprisoned. Napoleon and taken away to France, taken away from Rome from 1809 until 1814, which is when the Napoleonic project comes unraveled.
Yeah, and can we just remind our audience why the French revolutionaries were so strongly opposed to the Catholic Church?
Right. Well, they were strongly opposed to it because the Catholic Church, as in so much, or almost all really, of Catholic Europe, had been very, very closely entwined with the institution of the monarchy. What we call the Ancien Régime, the old regime before the French Revolution, is the period of absolutist monarchies. Now, I know that it's kind of like commonplace talk to assume that all pre-modern monarchies were absolute. And in the Middle Ages, I mean, that simply was not true. But in the early modern period, they were, because states were modern enough that central government had a fair degree of control over the territory that was legally theirs, and central government was the monarch. And the strongest underpinning of that was the church. So by absolutism, we mean the idea that monarchs reigned absolutely and that an official church said, and this is the will of God, and on peril of your soul, you must be obedient to this king. And the quid pro quo was that the monarch then imposed that church on the population. So after the Middle Ages comes to an end and the old way of doing things is no longer tenable, and that becomes obvious after 1648, this is the Catholic Church's consolation prize, as it were. And now that consolation prize is coming unstuck. with the rise of modernity, the Enlightenment ideas, nationalism, and so on.
Yeah, so the revolutionaries had some reason to be anti-religious
Yes,
establishment
yeah.
because religion had been used so forcefully by the monarchs. Yeah.
Well, we can see in this next picture that Pius presiding over Napoleon's self-coronation as Emperor of France in 1804. This is during the period of reconciliation between the two, before it all goes bad again. So Pius is there holding the crown, but when it comes to the moment of coronation, Napoleon takes it from him and places the crown on his own head,
Ooh.
indicating that he, representing the state, has superiority over the church. The church is there merely as a tolerated prop, not as a real partner. Okay, so Napoleon is defeated, and ostensibly the old order is restored. France is turned back to being a monarchy, with the other great powers watching it like a hawk in case revolution breaks out again. And France did indeed have several upheavals during the course of the 19th century. But nationalism is on the rise everywhere. Partly it would have been anyway, as the world modernized, towns got bigger, people no longer identified in the old traditional ways they had when they lived in parishes in the countryside, and the old landholding order was breaking down or becoming merely a part of society rather than all of it. But also, the process of French occupation during the Napoleonic Wars had spread the nationalist virus, if we can call it that, right across the continent. And so the 19th century is a century in which traditional governments are trying and increasingly failing to contain this change in public sensibility. Well, here we've got a map of Italy as it's reconstituted in something like its pre Napoleonic shape in 1815. And as you can see, the red shaded area there, central Italy, it had been governed by the Pope for 1,000 years. Those have been the papal states. And their existence was threatened by the rise of modern Italian nationalism, which wanted a united Italy, doing away with all of these small states and having a new united Italy. Well, Gregory the 16th, who is Pope from 1830, during his tenure of 16 years, he needed to look to Austrian help several times to suppress Republican guerrillas in the Papal States. He did have an army, but they were feeble and quite intentionally so. But he also banned railways, which he called chemin d'enfer. This is a little joke in French. Of course, railways in French is chemin de fer, right? Roads of iron. But this is chemin d'enfer, roads from hell. It banned gaslighting and other new technologies in the Papal States, foreseeing that they would increase trade and the growth of the middle class, and hence of liberal political forces.
I always thought of you as a tyrant, but this guy sounds like he's on the next level.
As a tyrant? Of me? Of all people?
Well, until somebody's been dragged around the Balkans with you, I suppose they
Ah,
wouldn't understand.
yes, yes, I suppose there is that. A mere detail, I assure you. Well, okay,
Right.
this guy, he's not meaning to be a tyrant. Nationalists complained that the Pope was a tyrant in his own realms, but in fact he was extremely mild. The real problem was that because he was so otherworldly and concerned with more spiritual things, his states weren't very well governed. And they were certainly way behind the times, even without him making a policy out of it. But although this sounds pathetic to us, he wasn't wrong in seeing that these modern inventions would indeed turn central Italy into a modern, urban, middle class trading society, which will unleash liberal political forces, which will call for the abolition of the Papal States and a united Italy. But this illustrates perfectly why the Catholic Church could not possibly win.
In other words, this guy had some pretty good foresight.
He did. He did have foresight, But it's kind of tragic in a way because he couldn't possibly win, or at least the church couldn't, not in the long term. In the short, yes, but in the long, definitely not. And that brings us to his immediate successor, Pius IX, Pio Nono, which is generally taken as being a wonderful joke in English, that the Pope who was saying no, no to the modern world. He is the longest serving Pope in history. When he was elected, he was wildly popular with liberals and nationalists, who are generally the same people in the 19th century. They thought this was some kind of a miracle because all of the cardinals were ultra conservative reactionaries, and he was the only one who wasn't, and he'd been made Pope. But that reputation didn't last long. In 1848, there were nationalist rebellions right across the continent, including in Rome, and he was chased out of his own city and had to take refuge across the southern border in the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, or Naples to the south. And he wasn't brought back for a couple of years, and when he was brought back by a French army, which was rather demeaning. And he realised that most of his own subjects didn't want him there. And he became an arch opponent of all modernising forces. There's so much we could say about him, and we can't afford to here. But he is one of the most important popes in history, and certainly the most important in the 19th century.
Now, Pius IX has had an extremely bad reputation ever since. Is it deserved? I mean, I seem to remember that you don't think so.
I don't think so. I've been spoiled by reading Owen Chadwick's wonderful biography of him. Owen Chadwick was not even a Catholic. He was a sort of very, very moderately evangelical Anglican, but a wonderful church historian specializing in the 19th century. And he has persuaded me that Pius was tragic, not evil. I mean, even most modern Catholics smite their brows when you mention the name of Pius IX, right, in despair. And non-Catholics, whether secularists or Protestants, will sometimes say, well, his career seems to vindicate their negative judgments on the Catholic Church. But Chadwick argues that he could hardly have done otherwise than he did, but that it was equally inevitable that in the long run this would put the Catholic Church into an absolutely impossible position. Well, like I say, there's so much we could say about him here, but we're not going to. We're going to move swiftly on. As we can see from this next map, the newly formed Kingdom of Italy, which was coming into existence during Pius's reign, seized the eastern half of the Papal States in 1860. That's the slightly purply bit on the map. And the rest, the sort of dark blue bit, including Rome itself, in 1870, leaving the papacy just the Vatican, which of course is what it has today. Vatican City is the last tiny remnant of what had been for 1,000 years a substantial secular realm. And the papacy refused to recognise the new Kingdom of Italy that had come into existence. And for the next nearly 60 years, was often referred to as the prisoner of the Vatican, because they wouldn't leave the Vatican. As they looked out of their windows, they looked on a country which they claimed should belong to the papacy and whose legitimacy as Italy they refused to recognise until 1929. More of that in a moment. So it's getting itself into an increasingly ridiculous situation and complete loggerheads with, well, all modernist forces, but here we're dealing particularly with nationalism. Well, let's look at this individual. He's not particularly important in himself. In fact, he seems to me to have been rather a nuisance. But he symbolises the kinds of dilemmas that people face. This is Alessandro Gavazzi. He had been a monk, but had nationalist opinions. And after 1848, he left Italy and went into exile in England and became a Protestant because he was so appalled by this conflict. And he was on the nationalist side and therefore against the Catholic Church. He delivered fiercely anti-Catholic lectures, so he becomes not only a Protestant, but what I call a hot prot, one of these rather unpleasant anti-Catholic Protestants. of whom there were many in the 19th century, and of whom we're now mercifully not completely free, but nearly free. Well, he goes to Canada and gives fiercely anti-Catholic lectures, particularly in areas where there are concentrations of recent Irish immigrants who've come there fleeing the potato famine. And so there are riots. And the suppression of the riots leaves 40 people dead. So he really did make himself a rather horrible nuisance. But his career illustrates the kind of tensions that lots of people from Catholic backgrounds felt, right? And particularly in the more liberal Catholic countries of Europe, like say Belgium, but also amongst Catholic minorities in Britain. You get lots of Catholics beginning sentences with the words "I'm Catholic, but," which American Catholics had been doing since the 18th century, so they were well used to it. But now you're getting loads of other people, even in Catholic countries themselves, feeling this kind of tension. Well, not all religious bodies felt the same degree of antagonism towards rising nationalism that Catholicism did, but they did all have at least some degree of antagonism to it. And we're going to turn now to look at the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, so of all the religious confessions, Catholicism was the one that had the hardest time with modern nationalism, but these other ones were a little bit less hostile.
Right, right. And the reason for that is that Catholicism is very obviously still today internationalist. Or perhaps the word we want is global, universal would be the word that it would choose for itself. So it's very uncomfortable with the idea of hard and fast national belonging of people, right? If people have a political belonging at all, it should be simply to whichever state they happen to find themselves in, preferably from the Catholic Church's point of view, a monarchy. But nationalism as an ideology, making moral claims upon people, it can never reconcile itself to that. Whereas Orthodoxy on the one hand and Protestantism on the other had always existed within a particular state. So Protestant state churches had related to the government of the state they found themselves in. So the tension was much less. And the same thing is true of Orthodox churches. But even they did feel some considerable discomfort with this new movement. Now, this is illustrated well by the career of this man, Vuk Stefanovich Karadzic. We've got his name there in Cyrillic letters and in Latin or Roman letters underneath. And he was influenced very much by Western ways of thinking. Nowadays, he counts as a hero in Serbia, as a national hero, for his various literary, scholarly, and cultural achievements. The motto that everybody remembers him for is "Write as you speak." We'll come to that in a moment. But he published books of Serbian folk songs and epic poetry. Nationalists everywhere were very keen on reviving traditional songs and generating what they considered to be national costume and so on. And he produced a grammar for the Serbian language in 1814 and a Riječnik, a dictionary, in 1818.
Can you spell out why grammar books and dictionaries should count as nationalist? I mean, they don't seem like it now. They just seem, well, a little bit boring.
Right. Well, depends where one lives. Even today, in this part of the world, the dreaded pravopis, which is like a school textbook telling you the correct way to write, is heavily politicized and keeps changing every few years. During the existence of Yugoslavia, the pravopis was trying to get children to minimize the difference between Serbian and Croatian ways of speaking and writing. And since the breakup of Yugoslavia, a succession of different editions have been trying to maximize that difference. So, but back in the 19th century, grammar books and dictionaries were trying to lay down a standard. This is our language, and this is the standard form, and the others are just dialects. So it's a political act. So partly it's internal within the language, but also it's laying down markers against the other. Now, a very mild version of the same thing can even be seen in America with Webster's Dictionary, or perhaps I should say, especially for our American listeners, Webster's Dictionary, because that's how he told Americans to pronounce it, right? And the changes in orthography, spelling in American English. And his idea was that we Americans are going to write and speak better English than the English. And we're going to purge it of various little quirks and things like that. Of course, that's impossible to do in any language. And he failed, not because he wasn't up to the task, but well, simply because nobody is. But it was trying to lay down a marker. This is going to be an American standard. Well, something rather more drastic than that was happening in most countries. And Karadzic was involved in this task. And in the process, he was rejecting the archaic Serbian standard, which used a lot of terms from Russian, but particularly from Church Slavonic, the liturgical language created for Slavs generally, in the 9th century by St. Cyril Methodius, in favour of current vernacular usages. Now, this was considered by the Orthodox Church to be impious. And he was opposed by churchmen who saw his orthographic reforms, changes in spelling and the alphabet and so on. For example, introducing the Latin J into the Serbian version of the Cyrillic alphabet. They saw this as undermining the Orthodox Church. And now, these changes were only possible in countries like Serbia, and as we'll see in a moment, in Romania as well, because at this period, still, levels of literacy were so low. So you could make these sometimes rather drastic changes, and you're not affecting that many people. You're affecting the rising generation of people learning to read and write. And many of the existing literate population, maybe just 5 or 10% of all people, in any case, will have been at least as comfortable reading or even speaking French or German or something like that. Well, he translated the New Testament into Serbian, this new style Serbian, in 1847, which again caused a row.
Yeah, why should the Orthodox clergy be mad about his translating the New Testament? Wouldn't they want people to be able to read the Bible?
No, well, I'm always very wary of playing into hot prot traditional polemics against the Catholic and then, in this case, the Orthodox Church. Well, these churches have unbiblical beliefs and they want to keep people in ignorance. And certainly Protestants talk like that. And actually, it's not entirely untrue. But in their own minds, what they were doing was the Orthodox clergy was that they were very wary of having the sacred language of Scripture in the hands of ordinary people, because that could do no other than elevate individual judgment. And the whole point of traditional societies and these traditional churches was collectivism, right? And that kind of demanded that the institutions have ownership, really exclusive ownership of the sacred books. So to produce a Bible in the vernacular language of ordinary people was itself kind of secularizing and emphasizing individual judgment, which the Orthodox Church saw clearly would erode the solidity of Orthodox society in the long term. Well, we have the same kind of thing, perhaps not quite as drastic, happening in Romania, where Romania actually changed alphabets. So in the early 1860s, Alexander Ioan Cuza, who was Prince of Romania, ordered a switch away from the Cyrillic alphabet in Romania as part of his modernist westernizing program of reforms.
So until then, this non-Slavic language had been written in Cyrillic, which was the alphabet specifically created for Slavic languages.
Right. So that seems kind of bizarre to us now, but the Romanians, they were not Greeks, who had their own alphabet, of course, and always had done, and they were Orthodox, and therefore they used Church Slavonic in church, and outside of church they used the Cyrillic alphabet to write their own language. So, yeah, it seems very strange to us, but that had been the case. So this prince is wanting to modernize and westernize his country. And so he said, well, Romanian is a Romance language. It has an awful lot of Slavic words in it, it has to be said, but it is fundamentally related to, Italian, perhaps particularly, but also more distantly French and Spanish and Portuguese and so on. And so logically, it should be written in the Latin script. The clue is in the name, Romania, right? Well, he'd also been involved in nationalizing monastic lands, so again, minimizing the power of the church. So, but traditional orthodoxy dictated adherence to the old alphabet, the old liturgy, and strict separation of the Orthodox people from the Catholic, Protestant, Uniate churches in nearby Transylvania and Bernard. And what better way to do that than by using a different alphabet? But the new Western sentiments of nationalism and populism pointed to the mostly non-Slavic structure and vocabulary of vernacular Romanian, and so used the Roman alphabet. Well, the church actually gave in with just a time lag of about 20 years, but they continued to use Cyrillic in their own publications for another 20 years, but then they caved. But nothing creates nationalism like somebody else's nationalism. And as the Ottoman Empire progressively unraveled through the later 19th century, so you get ethnic Turks doing the unthinkable and borrowing Western ideas and applying them to themselves. And that, again, is highly secularizing. Now, here we have an account of one of the young Turks in the early 20th century recalling how he was converted to the Turkish nationalist cause by one of his fellow students. At a cafe in Istanbul, classmate and old friend of Selahattin Bey's asked him the following set of questions. What are you? A student at the military school. So this fellow was already quite modern then. That's quite a modern thing to be. What else? I don't know. Think about it. I'm an Ottoman. So allied with the Ottoman state that he's part of. What else? I'm a Muslim. No. Before everything else, you are a Turk. Now, this kind of makes me want to laugh because it absolutely epitomizes nationalists and, as we shall see next week, socialists as well, who spent most of the 19th and 20th centuries going around telling people who they really were. Right, socialists telling everybody, never mind your nationality, you are a worker, right? You're working class. Working men of all nations, unite. Never mind your nationality. And nationalists saying, no, who you really are is nothing to do with your religion. It's nothing to do with the rulership under which you come. This is your real belonging. And lastly, in this context, we should also mention Theodor Herzl, the founder of political and secular Zionism. So that is modern Western nationalism. Finally, also generates Jewish nationalism, even though Jews, of course, are a minority everywhere. And that is a very secular movement that outrages devout Jews and rabbis. He's the founder of that in 1896, really, with his book, Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, in which he argues that Jews should go to Palestine and set up their own country there. Now, we have a lot more details on that in one of the episodes in our very first series, don't we?
Yeah, episode 4.
Episode 4 of our first series on It's a History of the Jews and Israel. Yes. Well, we mentioned at the beginning of this episode that World War I sees a huge shift in the nature of nationalism.
What was it that brought about this big change in nationalism, and how is it connected to World War One?
Well, I would contend, and I instantly concede, that this is a view peculiar to myself, but it's something that I've been thinking about for many years and intend to write about. World War I changes everything. Everybody agrees on that. And the mentality of many people changes right across the West in profound ways. World War One is a shattering experience, literally shattering, because it shatters all of the old empires, several of which are literally torn apart, and the Russian Empire descends into revolution and so on. But my own contribution would be this: that the end of World War One gives both nationalism on the one hand and socialism, which we can't really talk about now because we'll be dealing with next week, their head. Right? Yes, the late 19th century had seen the creation of a number of new nation states. So Italy, Greece, Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and so on. But the settlement at the end of the World War One attempts to draw new frontiers on the basis of national self-determination. That is, to give this nationalist ideology, this Enlightenment-derived ideology, its head, and to make that the basis for the new political order. And it also creates the first socialist state, the Soviet Union. That's not done by the peace treaty, it's done by the circumstances of how the war comes to an end. And so both of these ideologies are given their head. And of course, neither of them work. And people are left more unhappy than they were before. But it's in the nature of modern ideologues that you can't possibly admit that your ideology doesn't work. You've given your whole life to working for this. The reason it doesn't work is because this is not what human beings are like. We cannot possibly be summed up on the basis of 3 or 4 rationalist axioms. Right? We are extremely complex beings. So there's nothing more irrational than rationalism. Right? This is attempting to reinvent human societies de novo, as Rousseau would have approved, on the basis of a priori reasoning. Right? And it doesn't work. But the ideologues can't admit that. Much better then to say that the reason we're not happy now is because there are people conspiring against us. And so nationalism in many countries tends to metamorphose into fascism or something quasi-fascistic. It must be the fault of the nature of the peace settlement, which cheated us of territories we should have had, or of ethnic minorities in our midst, or of our neighbours who are determined to hang on to territory they shouldn't have, or claim stuff that is rightfully ours, or, of course, of the Jews. Right? All of these things. So this is nationalism taking a very different turn. And of course, what happens in the Soviet Union in respect of socialism is, well, we can't possibly admit that socialism is an absolute economic catastrophe. It must be the fault of saboteurs and Western and foreign agents in our midst who are sabotaging and destroying everything. And then you get the purges and on and on. Right.
Yeah, it's like because they can't admit that nationalism or socialism isn't working, it just has to become more and more fanatical until it sort of gets out of control.
Yes, yes. So it leaves its supposed beneficiaries less happy than before and radicalized and almost nihilistic, because at some level they must realize that the program doesn't work because reality isn't like that. So that creates a very different kind of nationalism. Let's first here consider Mussolini. So he seizes power in Italy. He's the first of the fascist leaders to actually come to power. These new style ultra nationalists. He's an ardent atheist, but he makes an agreement with the Vatican, the Lateran Treaty of 1929, which finally reconciles Italy with the papacy, or maybe the papacy with the existence of Italy, and pays compensation to the Vatican for the loss of territory, and declared Catholicism the only religion of the state, even though he very obviously doesn't believe in it. The other aspect of this is that he's also giving a sop to pious opinion in Italy with his kind of brand of ultra-nationalism as at least defending them from atheistic communism. And you get the same thing going on with the Nazis in Germany. Here's a Hitler poster from the 1920s. Germany lives. Actually, Es lebe Deutschland doesn't quite mean that. What it literally means is something more like that Germany might live, but that's not quite as resonant in English as it would be in German. And there's this visual allusion to Matthew 3:17, this is my son, listen to him with the dove and all of that.
Oh, so it's basically portraying Hitler as the Messiah.
Yes, as a Messiah figure, that's right.
Yikes.
And I mean, I have on my laptop a painting of a current politician whom I really mustn't name, who is portrayed as an angel ready to slaughter his political opponents, his domestic political opponents, outside the Garden of Eden. Yes. So
Yes, in other words, we're still doing this.
yes. So, and of course, it's as blasphemous now as it was then. Yes, but it's nevertheless falling back on this generalized, overblown, quasi-religious rhetoric, because the real focus of religion is the politics. And this is going to sound like quite a strong remark, but I mean, it's impossible not to notice it, that there are an awful lot of people today who would claim to be religious, but one can't help noticing that their real religion is their politics. Right.
Yeah.
And if that stings to anybody listening to us, well, take the burn. It'll do you good. This is not exactly a brand new phenomenon, and certainly goes back as far as the French Revolution. Well, our next picture is a campaign poster from the early 1930s. So we've got a muscular German worker. Both Nazis and communists were fond of portraying muscle-bound industrial workers. Schluss jetzt, wählt Hitler. So, an end of it, vote Hitler. And breaking Rousseau's darned chains again.
Remind me, why are you dragging Rousseau into this?
Well, because Rousseau is the one who says that people are born free, but is everywhere in chains. And that makes it almost irresistible for all kinds of ideologues since to claim that whatever circumstance they don't like constitute, at least metaphorically, some kind of slavery to which they have the solution in their ideology. And of course, that's what Hitler's doing.
Right.
But there is an attempt, even though Hitler and his circle absolutely despised Christianity and toyed with the idea of persecuting it, but always decided against, to court religious people. So within a few months of seizing power in early 1933, an opportunity falls into their laps because it's the 450th anniversary of Luther's birth. And they have a Nazi organization within the Protestant state churches, the so-called German Christians. And that gives them a big opportunity. So here is their magazine, Evangelium im Dritten Reich, the Gospel in the Third Reich. And here in the next photo, we have banners telling people to vote for these people in the church elections for a Reich bishop. So linking the cross and the Hakenkreuz, the swastika, the crooked cross. And who is elected but this man in the next photo, Müller, who is a pro-Nazi, and Hitler congratulating him.
Were all the churches in Germany going along with this stuff?
No, they weren't, but none of them were uncontaminated by this. Debate goes along furiously. So during the Cold War and in more recent times, communists and Marxists generally liked to argue that the churches were pro-Nazi, which was not true. And we have very strong evidence to the contrary. And also, we've got even stronger evidence that the Nazis were privately anti-Christian. But a more interesting discussion should be in what churches did the Nazis find support? And as so often happens when one confronts evidence realistically rather than with a previous agenda of one's own, it's kind of ambiguous and everybody has egg on their faces. So basically where the evidence points is that in the earliest period, in the 1920s, the Nazis picked up best in Catholic areas like Bavaria. But when push came to shove in the run-up to the Nazis coming to power in the 1930s, Catholic areas cooled considerably on the Nazis and Protestant areas were much more enthusiastic, as we can see from electoral data. So, yeah. Well, moving on from that very unedifying spectacle, let's come to the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 9 and various Republican posters.
So in Spain, the Republicans are the leftists.
Yes,
Why are they?
yes.
Yeah, why are they lumping Catholics together with Nazis?
Well, Republicans were dominated by Marxists of various shade, some Orthodox communists. The Soviet Union did send them some help, not as much as the Nazis sent the nationalists, but also anarchists. So they, following Marxist dogma, saw religion as the enemy to the kind of society that they wanted to create. And they were killing monks and nuns and priests. And so it's not surprising that the nationalists, who were led by Franco, who was not himself religious at all, it's not surprising that they tended to fall into his camp, at least as their protection. And Franco at least saw the social utility of religion, rather as Mussolini did. So, yeah, Republican propaganda will lump them together with Nazis and with the military, who were basically the core of the nationalist forces, and also with North Africans. So these leftists are certainly not above being racist in this period. And this next poster makes the same connection. It's another Republican poster. So a bishop's mitre only above a skeleton, perhaps associating, well, the very high death toll in the Spanish Civil War. So the bishop's mitre with a swastika on it, because of all the help that they were getting, the nationalists were getting from Hitler's Germany. And the next picture shows Spanish anarchists, so on the Republican side, shooting a statue of Christ before blowing it up in 1936. So again, what we've got in Spain is this new, rather nasty kind of nationalism, taking a more benign view of religion, even though, like Franco, they were not themselves religious, and utilizing religion for their own purposes. In France, we see the same kind of thing with Action Française, which was founded in 1898 during the height of the Dreyfus affair.
Yeah, and for more details on the Dreyfus affair, viewers can see episode 3, also of our very first series on the history of Jews in Israel.
Right. Well, Action Française was nationalist, which the French Revolution had been, but counter-revolutionary. So that seems like a contradiction. They were nationalist, but they were opposed to the French Revolution of more than 100 years before. Its leader, Charles Maurras, converted its original leaders to monarchism. They wanted to reinstate the monarchy in France. Not very practical, because the royal family had pretty much died out. And it supported restoring Roman Catholicism as the national religion, which, of course, would have been absolute heresy to France as it existed in the early 20th century, particularly after 1905. I mean, most viewers will be familiar with the fact that France is not merely secular, but secularist, and rigidly excludes religion from the public square. So they're wanting to reinstate it. But of course, the irony is that Maurras is not himself a Catholic. Most members were practicing Catholics, some were clergy, but Maurras was agnostic at least, and took a utilitarian view of religion, rather like the other far-right leaders, as a sort of social glue rather than as a true belief, which we're also finding, this is one thing that disturbs me a little, with some of Christianity's new friends nowadays, seeing it as socially useful rather than as necessarily true. And this fact led Pope Pius XI to condemn the movement in 1926 and excommunicate them the following year. And its newspaper, Action Française, was the first newspaper to be placed on the papal index of prohibited books, although the condemnation was lifted by Pius XII in 1939. Well, here's Charles Maurras, the principal ideologue, an atheist, but he saw France as threatened by 4 internal enemies: Protestants, Jews, Freemasons, and resident foreigners. So the usual kind of scapegoats of the new post-World War One far right, who are either actually fascist or at least tending that way. Now, the same thing is true in Romania. We only have time here to look at the most prominent of their leaders, Corneliu Zelea Codreanu. That name is kind of funny in a way because his parents were Ion, which is a Romanian name, Zelinski, which sounds more than a little Slavic to me. He'd renamed himself Codreanu, so Romanianized his surname, who is from Bukovina, which is the area right in the north of Romania today, and also in the adjacent areas of Ukraine. And his mother was Elizabeth, née Brunner, who was an ethnic German. So quite possibly Codreanu, this arch Romanian nationalist, didn't have any Romanian blood at all. He founds the Legion of the Archangel Michael, later known as the Iron Guard, which was ultra-Romanian Orthodox, anti-Semitic, opposed to non-Orthodox and non-Romanian minorities within the country. And although they get in trouble with the authorities, very serious trouble, nevertheless, the wartime regime in Romania does reflect those kinds of values, the World War II regime. So the new nationalism has little in common with the old nationalism. It's certainly not liberal. It is reactionary. It's certainly not democratic or quasi-democratic. It is authoritarian, and it's prepared to countenance religion, but religion as battle flag. It's humouring the religious, and those religious people who go along with it do so for a couple of reasons. Either, well, because they're prepared to be humoured, and because they're very afraid of communism. So, but then the net effect of both forms of nationalism, let's call it nationalism A in the 19th century, liberal, democratic, and nationalism B in the interwar period is the same. It is secularizing, because even the second one hollows out the real meaning of religious faith and simply turns it into a convenient battle flag. It's instrumentalizing it. So that is, as we said at the beginning, this is a very tangled story, but the net effect is secularization. And next week, we're going to look at the other big ideology coming out of the 19th century, which is socialism, and look at the secularizing effects of that.
Looking at this on the other end of the spectrum, basically.
Yes, nationalism's great rival. Yes.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us again. Hopefully, you're still hanging on, and if you really like us or really don't like us, make sure that you share and repost our episodes so that we can annoy as many people as possible.
Always a good idea. Our central purpose in life, I feel.
Yes, certainly.
Bye, everybody.
And we'll see you next week.
Bye.